So much looking forward to this very compelling agenda today. But now, what I would like to do, without any further delay, is I want to turn the stage over to our keynote speaker today, Kathryn Jablokow, Penn State engineering faculty, and currently on a 3-year term as program director at NSF. She's going to talk to us about the edge of uncomfortable, provocative, and engaging discussion. But Kathryn, please, if you'd tell us just even a little bit more about yourself and what brings you to this topic and to us today.
Thank you, John. And I'll start off by saying that I am invigorated to be here this morning and want to thank you for the kind invitation, but invigorated to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is really how people respond to new ideas. I've spent over 30 years now in academia, and the last few at the National Science Foundation, exploring, doing research, supporting research in the design science and system science areas. Those are my areas of expertise. And also leading sort of strategically the field in terms of NSF. And I've learned a lot about how people respond differently, different ways of thinking, when they come up to new ideas, when they come to edges between different things, between new disciplines, for example, or between the known and the unknown. And I was really struck yesterday by Pam Melroy's comment about the intersection of space and aeronautics. And so really just talking about those edges. And a lot of interesting things happen at those edges, which is what has brought me, I think, into our collaboration, so fascinated with what TACP is doing in terms of pushing those edges, looking for those edges. And so I hope that some of the comments I'm going to make today are going to be useful to you. What excites you about this topic, John?
Well, you know, when I hear you talk about leading edges, the fact that there are a number of specific leading edges, they're all different, trying to identify when we know we are working on a leading edge, how we measure that, and assess what that means in terms of the people that work well in one aspect of a leading edge versus others, and kind of the importance as leaders of paying attention to who's uncomfortable when and how we manage that and make that work, I think are all things that I want to hear about. So, Jonathan, if I may, if you could, back up to that first chart. And so Kathryn, thank you. Let me turn it back to you and jump into this. I'm really interested in hearing your view of leading edges, very different than the airfoils you see on the chart right now.
Absolutely, thanks. And I think one of the things that's curious about leading edges, when we talk about technical innovation, right, we often talk about searching for a leading edge, looking for a leading edge. We do that at the National Science Foundation. We talk about high risk, high reward research. We talk about transformative projects. In CAS, in TACP, you talk about wicked opportunities. So there's a lot of conversation about looking for those leading edges. But my claim is that leading edges are misleading. It's very difficult to know when you've reached one. And I like to think about the metaphor of the ship on the ocean. If I'm sitting on the ship and I look out at the horizon and I imagine that I plant a flag out at that horizon, I might convince myself that that's the leading edge. That's as far as we can go. That's it. But we know, of course, that if you keep going with that ship, if that ship keeps moving, that once I get a little bit further, I see there's more ocean beyond that flag, or there might be an island, or there might be a whole new continent. And so it's very difficult to know. And so when it comes to the metrics, that's where things get difficult, but they are well worth the time. So if you think about the normal metrics we use when we talk about innovation, we often talk about feasibility and viability and novelty and variety and quality. Those are all wonderful metrics, but they don't always get at that question of, have we gone far enough? Those metrics are really good for describing where we are right now. What's the quality of my solution right now? What's the novelty right now? What's the feasibility? But they don't really tell us, have I gone too far or not far enough? And so really thinking about those metrics, it deserves more than just, let's just dump all the innovation metrics we know about into the problem. Another point that I think may be helpful for us is to ask ourselves, is there really just one leading edge, or is there more than one leading edge? And maybe that's an image or a model that we can think about. So I like to use a diagram, something like the one that we have up above, and think about whatever the domain is. So you've noticed I say choose your favorite fill in the blank domain, and that's on purpose, because it could be a technical domain. It could be another kind. So it could be aeronautics, or it could be economics. It could be K through 12 education. It could be French literature, whatever the domain happens to be. If you think about it, there are parts of that domain that everybody recognizes. They're really well understood, and we're all very comfortable that those things live in that domain. But as we move a little bit further out, we come to things that, yeah, we all know that they belong in, say, aeronautics or economics, and we're comfortable with them, but they're a little less tied down. And then you move out a little further, and things become fuzzier. We're not really sure about them. We're not really sure, do they belong in our discipline, or do they belong somewhere else? And so when we talk about the leading edges in innovation, which leading edge are we talking about? Which leading edge should you be talking about at any particular point in time? So it's possible.
Yeah.
Yes, please, go ahead.
If I may. So, one of the things that we are very actively trying to do in CAS, the Convergent Error Solutions, and TACP overall, is to try to bring together people around large, challenging problems that require these multiple or multidisciplinary or multiple disciplines, embedded in the team that's looking to solve those things. It's a challenge, and I think it speaks to the nature of these multiple leading edges as people come in from different perspectives. But as you are sitting here as someone that a faculty member at a major university in the U.S., NSF program director right now, and beginning to get familiar with the way we're doing things in TACP and in CAS, where are you seeing common approaches? Where are you seeing ways in which we can learn from the way NSF is helping people think about these edges, and even academia? Do you have any reflections on that now?
Yeah, so I think that it's important that you know when you need to be working in what I'll call a safer zone, because you need to stick to your knitting. There are certain things that have to get done, and that they form the foundation for the other work you want to do that may be riskier. So you need to know where you are. And I see in CAS, for example, projects that are focused more on how do we find the far edges of this diagram? How do we push that? And that is an important function. And then perhaps in other parts of TACP, you're more focused on drilling down into the well understood work, because there's hard stuff there too. There are hard problems there too. So I see the range of kinds of problems and the range of edges throughout TACP when I look at what you're doing. Yeah. And yes.
No, and those edges, I think, are also evident in other parts of the portfolio. We're talking in a large way about TACP in this conference, but our advanced air vehicle program, our airspace operations and safety program that are looking at different parts of our airspace challenge and enterprise, aviation enterprise. We need to be bringing those perspectives into this as well. TACP covers a lot, but we got to be bringing in them.
Absolutely, and those might seem at first as if they're far out of view because they're very different. But if you move further towards the edges of uncomfortableness, long enough to see what's going on there, you can find the common ground so that you can pull them together. But you have to be willing to go far enough out to see what's on the other side of that edge. Yeah,
and so again, as you're familiar with some of the challenges that we have been taking on, I love the recognition here on this particular chart about metrics and about how we figure out what our targets need to be. And we're comfortable and we understand metrics, highly technical, percentage, improvement in a particular characteristic in the aviation system, papers, outreach, and a variety of things. But boy, I can see how metrics that are pushing us towards these boundaries where the real stuff happens is much harder to define. What have you learned? What can you tell us about metrics?
So when you look at the different metrics that, again, as you say, the technical metrics that we are used to, there's quite a bit of variety in those metrics as well. But there are other kinds of metrics that I think technical people forget about. So we have, more qualitative versus quantitative metrics, for example. We have metrics that the folks in the social sciences understand, or even in psychology that they understand, or the business folks that are looking at, viability. All of those different kinds of metrics need to be at least considered while you're working towards these fuzzier edges.
Yeah, and as engineers and scientists, largely on the less soft side of that spectrum of science, is something that we often struggle with. To put things together that allow us to be much more productive. So thanks for that sharing, like that.
It's absolutely a challenge. And it actually brings me to the next chart that I want to talk about. And that is the fact that, innovation in general, it makes people uncomfortable. I mean, we're talking about the edge of uncomfortable. Innovation makes us uncomfortable. Sometimes, and uncomfortable isn't always a bad thing. Right. Uncomfortable just means I feel like I want to change something. There's something that isn't quite, calming to me right now. And as technical people, I think that sense of uncomfortableness, what at our house I call my spidey sense, sort of the Spider-Man sort of sense, that little tickle that goes up the back of your neck, or that little twitch that you do in your shoulders. That's not a metric that we normally think about, but it is a metric. And I strongly believe that it's a metric we need to pay more attention to. When do we feel uncomfortable about things? And how do we leverage what I call that human capacity to sense when we're getting to the edge of something? Because it's a holistic kind of metric. It isn't a metric that comes with just one scale, but it's a sense of, there's something about this idea that excites me. It's that kind of uncomfortable. Or it's an uncomfortable sense because I'm not sure that we should be doing what we're doing right now. And I think sometimes technical people shove those feelings aside and say, no, I can't measure it with calipers, so it's not worthwhile. But it's very important. And I think it brings me to the next sort of suggestion, which is we're not all uncomfortable at the same time. We're not all uncomfortable for the same reasons. And so one of the things we need to remember is, and keep track of, who is uncomfortable when. And there are lots of different ways of measuring this. So I'm just presenting one that has been a big part of my research over the years. It comes from something called adaptation innovation theory. And it was developed by a British organizational psychologist. His name was Michael Curtin. And basically it says, people have different preferences for the amount of structure that they use. And we get uncomfortable when what we're really doing at the moment, it doesn't match. It's that preference. So you've got people who love to dig down into the details, who are more comfortable when the structure is more certain. And you have people who are more comfortable when the structure is really loose and it almost feels chaotic. And you've got everything in between. And so when you think about exploring those edges, realizing that some people are going to feel really comfortable in that core of whatever you're doing. And other people are going to feel more comfortable out at that fuzzy edge where I'm trying to plant my flag in the ocean. And other people are going to be comfortable in the middle. And that is a tremendous value to you as an organization to be watching for that and to see who is uncomfortable when. And I like to think of it in terms of the ancient maps and the dragons. So that when you had an old map, right, when you got out far enough that you didn't know where you were going, they would draw dragons because there was obviously something awful that was going to happen out at the edge there. And when you think about these differences in people's comfort, we have different dragons. So those folks that like structure, their dragons are, we're going to get somewhere and we're not going to know the right way to do things. We're not going to have a set of rules. But there's the other people, the folks that like that unstructured world, their dragons are, oh my goodness, somebody's going to nail me down. Somebody's going to tell me that I have to do it this way. So we have different fears of what is on the other side of that leading edge. And so, John, I want to throw it back to you for a minute.
Yeah.
You know, in your interactions and what you're doing here at NASA, what kind of dragons are there out there on some of these edges that you see?
Yeah, so I love this dragon image. I love this particular chart also, bringing us back to the the Flat Earth Society and like, and so much of what NASA has done over its time, and other key scientists, is help us think about the fact that our view of the world is changing, is evolving, and we have to bring in people that are helping us think about that. So I personally, and in the kinds of things that I'm looking for in TAC-P, are the sort of things that are those that understand the importance of structure, but structure when necessary, not tying down, giving us that opportunity to explore, to innovate, to learn quickly, maybe to fail, and I'll put that word in air quotes, but not be as successful as we had thought as we are learning and redirecting and finding new paths and good paths. So that's kind of my reaction to what you've laid out before, but I have a somewhat different question that I guess I want to pose. As managers, as leaders, here at programs or at our research centers, we're looking to pull together the most effective teams to take on the challenges that we face, the complex systems challenges that we need to solve and address. We've got very talented people. They are in different places. They are uncomfortable in different ways and in different places.
Yes.
How do we think about the way in which we put together a team when we are pulling together people that are structure first versus but are willing to adapt versus less structure and no boundaries in a sense, but we'll fall back on those things that allow them to keep from falling off the edge, perhaps.
Right.
How do you see that? How do we use this to leverage and put together a team?
So one of the things you need to think about first is the problem that team is focused on, and what are the desired outcomes of that problem. So if the desired outcomes are something at that far fuzzy edge, then the team needs to lean that way. But you don't want to have everybody living out at that fuzzy edge because, again, they might not have the structure to keep themselves from falling off. And so in that case, you might want to have, you definitely would want to have some folks who are, have a preference for the structure, who can make sure that the bills are getting paid, the details are getting done right, et cetera. If you've got a problem that perhaps is more about, we need to take the current structure we've got, but we need some novelty in how we implement it, or we need some novelty in how we fill out the last details, a little bit like the periodic table of the elements. Now you might need a team that leans more towards that adaption and that adaptive end, but you don't want everybody there. You want to have a few people who can help recognize when what they're doing at the core might actually have applications, say, in another field. So it's really important to look at the problem. And if you can think about sort of the mean or the mode of the team is matching that problem, but you want enough diversity that if the problem moves in either direction, you've got people there who can kind of catch it. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
No, well, I'll be honest, these are all problems that we address one at a time, and there'll never be an answer to the question, but those are clearly considerations that we need to bring in as we are identifying the problem, our people that are challenged and want to be taking this on, and where they reside. But also, as you were talking, the metrics, how we are looking to measure our success is also a factor in the way we're defining the problem, the way we are identifying what those targets are, and then hence the people that are going to best be able to get us to those targets. So it's coming full circle with this, the metrics, the edges, and all. Good.
And with the metrics, I'll just say one more thing here is that people who have these different, this cognitive diversity, which Pam was talking about yesterday as well, if you recall, she was talking about the importance of that thinking diversity. They will have different metrics that that resonate with them. So people who perhaps are living on the less structured end, they may think more about novelty. They may think more about variety. Whereas people who live in the middle of the spectrum, or maybe towards the more adaptive end, may be thinking more about quality. And so that's another reason for having a diverse team, is that people have more comfort or less comfort with different metrics as well. And so that should be part of the conversation when you're looking at these problems.
Yeah.
So maybe we can sum up just a little bit as we're leading on to the question time. And I wanted to put together, 5 things. It's more than the 3 that people normally want to remember, but I tried to put 5 things together that maybe could help people resonate and help people remember what they heard. And the first is that leading edges can be misleading. Just because something is far away doesn't mean that's as far as you can go. In fact, there may be more than one leading edge. And thinking about things in terms of different leading edges could be a better way of working towards the innovation you're looking for. As you and I have talked about several times here, choosing the right metrics is hard work. And it's something that should be considered out loud and should be considered as part of the dialogue when you're putting these teams together. Innovation makes people uncomfortable. But that's not always a bad thing. It just means that people have this sense, this capacity to know when they're getting close to an edge. And paying attention to who is uncomfortable when is a critical thing for leaders, for managers, in fact, for every team member to be doing. Yeah. And so I wanted to sort of throw a question out to everybody today, everybody who's listening, to think about, who are you making uncomfortable today? And I want you to look in the mirror and think to yourself, am I on that list? Am I making myself uncomfortable today in a way that will lead us forward? Yeah. So those are kind of my final thoughts.
Yeah, so it's a great way to sum that up. And I love this question. So one of the things that I think is important, at least for the program that I've had the opportunity to lead here, is doing things that I wouldn't have used before. Today, I wouldn't necessarily have used the word uncomfortable, but I would be describing it in terms of things that are having us rethink what we believe we know about our future and our opportunity space. So I frankly hope that I am making myself uncomfortable and my team uncomfortable as we work through these challenging decisions on the problems we need to pick up. But so one thing I do want to kind of bring us back into the meat of this discussion a little bit, Kathryn, is we've got, I don't want to call it phases, but we have 2 different approaches to dealing with our portfolio. Some of it is on the execution side, where we have decided here is a challenge, a significant technical challenge, system challenge that we want to take on, and we need to put together people that are going to build a solution towards that. And the kind of discussion that we had about leveraging people who are uncomfortable in different ways at different times is going to be important to being able to push ourselves.
Yes.
But we also need to be making the right decisions in the first place on what those technical challenges are that we take on, how we look across the our opportunity space and say, this is a big problem that we should get into and we should begin to find solutions for. We need people that are uncomfortable in different ways, that are helping us think about what we do, not necessarily how we do it, but what we do. Any Any different thoughts from you on the problem definition, how we define it, the strategic direction, uncomfortable edges, versus the execution, uncomfortable edges?
So let's talk about choosing the problems. So how do you know what you should be doing, not just how you should be doing it? And again, I think that people, if you think about that spectrum of how people approach structure and how people approach the core, the people who know the detail best, so the people who like detail, who like that structure, will know it best. They're the best folks to be able to identify problems in that space that need to be done. There's novelty there, there's interest there, there's importance there. People with sort of that less structured approach, they tend to be looking out in directions that may be kind of tangential to what you would normally do and be able to identify opportunities there. They may not be able to tell you, do we actually have everything in place to do it, but they can see those opportunities. And so you may actually find people on your team disagreeing about which problems you should take on, because they're looking at it from different perspectives. Is it a problem that involves, something we're doing right now, but it can really be a springboard for moving forward? Or is it a problem that sort of lives on the edge of a new field? And those strategic decisions within your portfolio is something that I do at NSF. I do the same kind of thing. I'm looking for some projects who are really, I have no idea if they're gonna work or not, but if they will, they're going to transform the space. And other projects that I'm more certain about their success, and they're going to transform things by being a foundation for the next stage. So in terms of choosing your problems, I see very good similarities between what you might be doing and what I do at NSF.
Yeah, and as someone that tends to be more at the decision side of that challenge space, right? Mm-hmm. I need to turn your question around a little bit about not who am I making uncomfortable, but how am I making myself uncomfortable? And what does that say about the strategic decision opportunity that I am facing, and being not just pragmatic, but truly understanding of, am I being forward-leaning enough? Yes. How do I listen to this team to take on those major opportunities going forward and be more innovative? So, excellent.
Absolutely.
And this is a great segue to lead into the Q&A, and it's time for that anyways. But because there have been a few questions in the IO system, I would encourage everyone to load up some questions if you would like. They really are related to this and to the issue of discomfort specifically. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a question in there that talks about the strict reliance on metrics and how that might inhibit research, and that is very uncomfortable. But I heard something, and I've read in your research, Kathryn, and correct me here. We talk about metrics, or you talk about metrics being less of pure measurements of like 2% gain or 3%, and more of almost like a forcing function for discussion. Is that correct? And if so, could you elaborate on a little more?
Yes, I mean, there are times when we need to measure something very precisely, and that's an important part of what we do. But I'm saying that metrics should be part of the discussion to figure out where we're going, to be talking about. I love your term forcing function. I love that. That they are an input to the discussion. What should we be measuring? What do we want to measure? What can we measure now? And what can we measure about the future? Or what would we like to measure someday? Those should be part of our decision-making process in deciding what projects to work on, which directions to take. At NSF, I often have PIs come to me with their projects, and they want to measure something I never thought of. I never even thought of measuring a certain thing in, say, systems engineering or design science. And it opens up my mind to what kinds of directions might I be going in my portfolio. So I love that phrase, and I think that matches exactly the message I was trying to relate.
And John, I think it also goes with what you just said regarding the problem formulation and identifying the problem. There's different measurements or metrics you can put into place when you are formulating the problem versus when you're investigating a technical solution. So do you see that as a critical component of when we do understand the problem space and define it a little more?
Yeah, no, I certainly do. And again, it's the challenge that I have with my project management team to be appropriately open to the number of ideas that are coming up and how we determine where those risks are important to take. In certain respects, there's a risk versus opportunity cost discussion that we have that overlays this entire conversation. We have folks that are more structured based that may be much more comfortable with the classic risk management approach to understanding where they fit and how far they want to go against that edge versus others that look at the opportunity side more so and are willing to push. We need to be good stewards of all these investments. We got to make smart decisions on how we go forward. So making sure that I've got the right balance of perspective on that is really critical. And I'd like to think that a lot of what we're doing in CAS, a lot of what we're going to hear about throughout the rest of this day are parts of that decision space that's giving us good information going forward. I want to make sure that I'm thinking now about the people we're bringing in. Where are they uncomfortable? And what is that appropriate uncomfortable nature that we can think about that drives that forcing function for discussion? So I like it.
No, I love that answer. I love that it's both. You need all components. And Kathryn, you had that one chart with the scale on it with the two polar ends, and it needs to have the combination of both, as you say. And it's that combination that brings the diversity needed for innovation in an organization. And I love that theme. There's a question in the chat that is related in one way, and it asks you specifically, Kathryn, is there any advice on from your research of any organizational structures that may be more adept to promoting risk taking that or some that should be avoided that might really get in the way of that?
Okay, so I'll go back a little bit to my answer when I was talking with John about teams, how you put a team together, and that same, what I call the cognitive culture of an organization is the same thing. So if I want an organization that is going to be focused more on the risk taking versus the opportunity cost, then I want to have, if you imagine that spectrum again, the organization to kind of live more towards the end that I'm going to call a little bit less structured. In other words, the structure perhaps is more networked rather than hierarchical, so that people can interact with folks at all different levels of, say, the organization as they're looking for opportunities. So more of that network structure, I think, is what's good for organizations that want to be a little bit out more on the edge. There's nothing wrong with a hierarchical structure. Sometimes that's exactly what you need when you want to get things done. Boom, boom, boom. And you don't have the opportunity for risk that can't be in your what's your daily life. And so, looking at the structure itself in terms of the amount of network versus amount of hierarchy is one of the things that you can do.
Excellent. There's a great question too, as we talk about, we've talked a lot about metrics, and that's the front end. But when you think of the back end in organizations are driven by their performance metrics and their performance reviews and what motivates behaviors and what rewards behaviors. So there is a question in the chat that brings a pretty good concept to this: is how do you structure within management a proper reward system? And especially in an agency like NASA that is very focused and has decades of rewarding very deep expertise in a technical subject. How do you expand that measurement system and reward system to emphasize some of this risk-taking culture that we're looking for to combine with that deep technical expertise?
Yeah, so I like to think of expertise as sort of if you can imagine a two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system here. Let's talk engineering. And I imagine that on the vertical axis is expertise. And so I have that goes from a little bit to a lot. And we want to reward not only how much somebody has, but do they have it in the right things? So I can be an expert, you know, in German cooking, but that isn't what you want today. You need somebody who knows about electrical engineering, let's say. So that's one axis. And then you have this other axis, which even on the chart I had before was purposely horizontal, which is looking at types of preferred behavior. And so in that case, it was very structured behavior or very structured outcomes all the way to perhaps the less structured and left field sort of outcomes. And so if you can think about different kinds of reward metrics or reward mechanisms for people, depending upon where you want them to be. Now in NASA, you know, high expertise, you're not looking for low expertise, but high expertise in certain areas, that's what you want to reward. If you want to reward the more risk-taking behavior, then you need to find ways of encouraging people to fail. Failure it happens more when you're on that end of the spectrum. Failure can happen on the structured end, but it tends to look different, and it can be disastrous, right? If the structure falls out from under us. So I like to think of it along two axes and sort of separate the way that we're rewarding, because otherwise things can get very convoluted and people may feel they're being punished for one thing or rewarded for one thing when it's actually something else. Yeah. So I think that's where I would begin.
Yeah, and failure, again, as I brought that up early in the conversation with the rabbit ears. Yeah. It is charged word in many respects. Yeah. And to be honest, it's not what we are rewarding. We are rewarding, or we want to be rewarding, a rapid learning. And if that is done at times by taking an idea, experimenting quickly, finding it doesn't work and moving on to the next thing, that is really good. And making sure that we have elements in terms of our recognition and reward structure that says, you learn this very quickly. You know, you weren't successful the first 6 times, but damn, you got to number 7 faster than we would have otherwise, and look at where we are.
Exactly, right? Exactly. And it's that kind of different perspective on measuring, on metrics, and on rewarding that will encourage people to try new things, which is what you want them to do.
Yep.
Right. And that's a great point. I loved your slide on dragons, and that we all have the dragons, even on your spectrum slide. It's great to say I am fine making John uncomfortable. That is okay. I think it's beautiful. I love the research that said that. But wait until the discomfort comes to me, and is it something different? And so do you have any thoughts or advice on how we embrace discomfort without being paralyzed by it, which is a natural tendency?
So if you have this diversity, which I am absolutely sure you have in NASA, I'm sure you've got the whole spectrum of people there, is to remember that when you are uncomfortable, somebody else is comfortable there. And use that as your backup. It's like, I'm going into new territory here. I'm not too sure about this. Who around me is comfortable there? Who can prop me up? Who can encourage me? Who can, give me new ways of feeling assured? And so that sort of buddy system, if you will, is one of the ways that we can work through our discomfort without feeling completely threatened by those dragons.
And why putting together the right team, a team that has trust across these different levels of discomfort, such that you do have that buddy that is you have a common objective, as much as you want to get to that objective, perhaps at a different path. So I think that's a great way to end our discussion this morning. So Jonathan, again, if we go to that last chart.
I do want to say thank you in many ways from many directions. So thank you as a Penn State person who is able to talk about my research a little bit. Thank you from an NSF perspective for the partnership that we're developing here with you at NASA. I think it's very important that as agencies we learn from each other, and that we're listening to each other, and that we're looking outside ourselves and saying, wow, what are they doing over there? Yeah. And I want to thank you for this unique form of non-keynote, which might have made somebody uncomfortable at some point, but in a way that I just truly enjoyed it. So thank you so much for having me.
Kathryn, and many, many thanks to you as well. It's a great way to start off the day. So, Steve.